Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by Samantha Kreling, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in the Peru lab. She joined us to discuss her new BioScience article, So Covert It's Overt, Wildlife Coloration in the City. We had a great chat, and it spanned topics ranging from the Industrial Revolution to human-wildlife conflict, hunting, evolution, and camouflage, and a lot more. So with no further ado, let's go straight to the interview. All right, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're going to be talking today about evolution in the urban environment and how it affects, the coloration and appearance of various species. But I wanted to talk first just a little bit about evolution itself. I think oftentimes there's a tendency to think of it as a settled manner. These are things that happened over, millions of years. But there's actually quite a lot that's going on in the here and now.
Yeah, definitely. So I do think there's definitely that tendency to kind of think of evolution as something that happened in the past, and now we're left with all of these species and they're remaining unchanged. This is how they are. But in reality, that's not quite what's happening. And we're seeing that evolution can actually happen on a lot quicker timescales than we maybe previously had thought.
Okay, and we're talking today specifically about, urban environments. And I'm wondering, what are the sort of, just generally speaking, drivers and, things that are kind of pushing selection in those types of environments? I think we're all very familiar with, what happens in what would be considered a wild landscape. But what are sort of the general features of an urban environment in terms of evolution? It's not something that I'd thought about much previously.
Yeah, so I mean, the same evolutionary kind of mechanisms that are available in non-urban areas are available in urban areas, right? You have your adaptive selection, your non-adaptive selection, things like genetic drift. So all of those are at play in urban areas, but the rates at which some of these things happen might be slightly different. And so in urban areas, we tend to have a lot more fragmentation in the landscape. We have a lot more chemicals and mutagens in the landscape that could potentially be affecting mutation rates. Kind of that higher level of fragmentation might mean that we'll have higher levels of genetic drift in these kind of smaller populations sometimes. And then we just have a lot of different novel stimuli that you're not finding in these non-urban environments, and a lot of anthropogenic influences that are a lot stronger. So you can think of anything from, human-driven mortality through vehicle collisions that are happening probably at slightly higher rates in more urbanized regions than in non-urban regions, or anything like that. So lots of different selections that are coming from people and kind of the environment we've built up.
Okay, and I guess now the big question, just to get us started, would be, what are we typically seeing, among species in terms of their adaptations? What sorts of things are going on?
So I think this is really a kind of a new field right now. And so we don't know a ton. There are actually very few conclusively driven studies that have found adaptive evolution happening in cities. There's a handful, I can't remember quite how many, but just a handful. And so we know a couple things. So Shane Campbell-Staton has a bunch of great work on anoles and how kind of thermal tolerance changes in urban areas. There's some great papers on, of course, the black peppered moths that change color due to the Industrial Revolution. That's kind of what I would think of as the first case of urban evolution, kind of us realizing it's happening.
Okay, so let's talk about the black peppered moth for a second. For those who might not be familiar with that example, this is a case in which the Industrial Revolution it unleashes great amounts of pollution and sort of changes the appearance of the landscape, and they have to adapt.
Yeah, so with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, we had these kind of light barked trees that these pepper moths were on, and at the time before the Industrial Revolution, these moths were largely light in color, so they blended into these trees. But post-Industrial Revolution, we have a bunch of soot and chemicals in the air. It darkens the bark of these trees, and therefore predators were able to see these lightly colored moths really easily against that dark background. And so it ended up selecting for these darker colored moths, and those ended up proliferating throughout that environment.
Okay, and that had to have happened pretty rapidly, right? I mean, the Industrial Revolution was not all that long ago.
Yeah, I think Kettlewell's experiments on this was in the 1950s or something like that. So really not that long ago at all.
Okay, and I'm wondering now, about in the article specifically, we're mostly talking about, coloration of wildlife and how that can change. And, I think it was interesting to me that it was in ways that I might not have expected, that you see more, not necessarily outlier coloration variations, but, things that are perhaps different from the norm. What sorts of trends are there?
So the thing about this is we actually really haven't studied it much at all. So there is a recent review that came out in 2021 that found, I think, about 60 different papers that had, somewhat touched this idea of change in coloration across an urbanization gradient. But it was really only on 3 different species. So it was on, I think, great tits, the pepper moths, and I want to say rock doves. That's what it was. And so we have some knowledge about these very few species, but there's not really enough knowledge to give these vast trends, which is kind of my reason for writing this paper and kind of hoping that people pay attention to this, because coloration is so important on like an ecological standpoint, for animal communication and thermal regulation and just kind of avoidance of predator and prey. But also from like a human perspective, there's kind of some interesting things going on in how we perceive animals that are differently colored than other individuals in that population.
Yeah, and I want to jump into that a little later on. I thought the examples about, not shooting leucistic deer, I thought that was a really interesting example. But, one of the things I was interested in was the roadkill phenomenon with squirrels in particular. How does that come into play in terms of coloration?
Yeah, and so that was a paper that came out in 2022, I believe. But they were looking at these eastern gray squirrels and noticed that there was kind of a melanistic decline around these northern latitudes in the United States. And they found that they're more prevalent in urban areas. And the hypothesis at the time was kind of that people were able to visually see these darker squirrels against kind of the pavement color, and were able to avoid hitting them more often than gray squirrels that would blend in a little bit more. So their thought was that perhaps that was driving this increase in melanism across these urban areas.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I mean, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I think, the time I was growing up a very long time ago was just about the time that they'd crossed the Potomac River and had kind of established themselves in those sorts of urban areas. So there's cases in which, actual human ability to see, preference and stuff like that is actually driving evolution, or maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Potentially. I think there might be a follow-up to that paper coming out. I think I saw a preprint where it might be driven by rural clients as well. So I think we'll have to stay tuned on that exact example to see exactly what people come up with. But I do think that kind of humans being able to visually see these different animals could potentially lead to preferential treatment if they think they're cool. Or, if you're driving a car and you can see an animal, you're probably less likely to hit it than an animal that you're not really able to actually visualize.
Yeah, that would definitely help. I'm wondering about what kinds of environments we're talking about when we say, an urban landscape. Obviously, there's a large gradient and there's a lot of variation from place to place. So just broadly speaking, what types of places are we talking about in this article in particular?
That's a great question. So I think it's so complicated. We don't really have that great of a definition of urban, if you ask me. And depending on who you ask, the definition changes. And so when I was writing this paper, I was really just thinking of urbanization as kind of a concept. What changes between any, let's say, more or less untouched landscape and even like a suburban landscape, right? You're going to have higher amounts of cars, you're going to have higher amounts of people and building density, this more impervious surface. We know that kind of predator regimes often change and you get more mesopredators than apex predators. So kind of regardless of what level of urbanization we're talking about, I think some of these things could come into play. They might be at various strengths and whatnot, but I think I'll use my friend Liz Carlin. She has a great analogy on different cities, but she kind of refers to them as McDonald's. So depending on, all cities you can think of as kind of these McDonald's, right? They all have a menu that people enjoy, but depending on what country you're in, that menu is going to change. So we have kind of this idea of urbanization, but within individual cities, we have different menus, right? The different mechanisms and different drivers in those cities vary a little bit.
Let's talk about coatis a little bit. You mentioned them before we started recording, and that they were sort of in some sense an inspiration for some of this work.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that and what sorts of phenomena are at play?
Yeah, and so this whole paper kind of came about when I was, I think, 19, and was fortunate to take a trip down to Mexico in the Playa del Carmen region. And I remember going to this golf course with my dad, which I hate golf, but there's always animals, so I'm at least interested in golf courses in that way. But I remember looking out and seeing all these coatis, and most of them were kind of like this normal color, kind of that like light brown color that we expect them to be. And then there was a handful that were kind of this bright white color. And my first thought was, well, that's weird. Like, why haven't those been eaten by something yet? And then I realized that we're kind of in this human-dominated system. Predators probably don't exist there as much anymore, and that kind of probably allowed the proliferation of these different color morphs in these regions. And that kind of sparked this entire paper really. And then I funneled down into somehow 13 hypotheses on this.
Right, and we definitely don't have to go through all of them, but maybe we can talk about a couple of them. So one thing you mentioned earlier that we didn't chat about yet is the potential that there are mutagenic chemicals and stuff like that in the urban environment. What does that do, and how does that sort of affect evolutionary processes, or the tendency to take on a different appearance or something like that?
Yeah, so we know that mutation on its own is not a very strong evolutionary force, and the majority of mutations that are going to happen are either negative or like missense mutations, and they don't actually change anything in our kind of protein production. But there are those times when mutation does confer these benefits, and so the idea is that if you are in an environment where we know we have a lot of chemicals that are mutagenic or could potentially be altering the DNA in individuals or their gametes, then you have a higher rate of mutation, higher mutation load. There's a higher probability that one of these mutations that confer like alternate coloration may occur. And because we also have higher densities of wildlife in urban areas, oftentimes, it means that you're kind of at a higher probability of those mutations taking hold in that population as well.
Does fragmentation play into that as well? So that, if you happen to see one of these unusual color morphs, it would be more likely to become established because it's, less likely to evolutionarily fade, to use an absolutely incorrect term?
Yeah, so I think definitely that's part of it too. And when we have this higher fragmentation, you also have higher drift. So just by chance, those mutations could kind of get centered in those populations.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So, one of the other things that I was kind of curious about was the potential for there to be sort of this domestication syndrome. And I know is that only hypothesized at this point, or is that something established?
As far as I know, it's only hypothesized.
So, what would that be? And we can go back and, talk about some, I think they're Russian foxes, are they? But just in general, what the syndrome is and how that might sort of affect species living in an urban environment.
Yeah, so the domestication syndrome is kind of a suite of characteristics kind of determined mainly by this neural crest cells that end up lessening, and you get, if we take the silver foxes and dogs in general, or canids, you kind of get these like shortening these features that are more puppy-like, these rounder faces and floppy ears and curly tails and all these weird coat patterns and things like that. And we also see kind of coinciding changes in behavior and sociability in these animals. And so theoretically, I'll use coyotes as an example because I study them and it's the easiest one, I think, to kind of think about. In an urban area, coyotes are probably selected for if they're somewhere along the continuum of slightly being more bold, but not too bold that they're getting into trouble. So able to deal with a lot of novel stimuli, but not so bold that, they end up getting shot because they get in conflicts and things like that. But there is a hypothesis that if we are kind of pseudo-selecting for these more bold individuals, these ones that are able to be around people a little bit more, that we're kind of inducing this kind of domestication syndrome, perhaps on accident. And if you're linking these kind of docility behaviors to and boldness at the same time, if you're linking those behaviors to the physical traits that they sometimes coincide with, then perhaps we'll start seeing these kind of different coat colors coming up, like white tail tips and these like chest blazes, and even brindling or melanism within different populations.
Oh, that's interesting. So you sort of start to see those, traits that, may not be directly selected for, kind of occurring potentially as a result of behavioral, selection for certain behaviors.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering now about predation. We touched on it a little bit, but how does predation differ as a factor in selection, in an urban environment, just generally speaking, and maybe drilling down into an example than it does in, a place that's less affected by sort of human influences, say?
Yeah, I think this is kind of multifaceted, but for one, in urban areas, largely people have eradicated apex predators because they're a little bit difficult to live around when you have a bunch of people. And also, they're not that tolerant usually of kind of urbanization and the different things that brings with it at a landscape level. But we do tend to have larger amounts of mesopredators in urban areas. And so you'd think that predation rates would be pretty high, but because of a lot of anthropogenic subsidies and foods that we're, leaving out that animals can access, predation rates tend to be lower in urban areas. And so we kind of have this human shield effect where we're kind of blocking large predators. And while we have a lot of mesopredators, or these middle-sized predators, they're not necessarily actually taking advantage of all of the prey in these areas. And so in that way, you might release prey for being able to have these kind of narrow colorations that they would need to have in non-urban areas in order to avoid predators. And at the same time, you might release predators from having to, conceal themselves from their prey if they're no longer really needing to hunt and kind of conceal themselves if they're, ambush predators, or if they, need any sort of camouflage to not be seen by their prey. You might release them from that constraint.
So I'm wondering, in general, do these effects, kind of, are they interactive with each other? We've talked about a bunch of things that would be affecting, the way that animals may present themselves. But do all these factors kind of play off of each other, or, are they mostly operating in sort of an isolation?
I mean, I think everything operates together, but how they operate is like pretty complex, and I don't think we know quite yet on how they would interact with each other. And I think it's pretty hard to kind of speculate what directionality a lot of these trends would have, especially when they start to interplay with each other. So I guess that's just my call for we should study this more, because no one really knows.
I've never heard that before from a scientist. So I'm wondering now about the effects of climate change. We are familiar with the urban heat island effect. We know it's a little bit warmer in urban areas. Do we expect to see more effects from a hotter climate, and kind of do we have any reason to believe that they will be in one way or the other particularly?
Yeah, I think potentially. So thermoregulation in endotherms, mammals mainly that we're talking about here, is a little bit more complicated to understand in terms of coloration. We don't necessarily know how coloration affects thermoregulation totally. There are some trends like Loger's rule, but we don't know it totally. So sometimes in desert animals, you get really dark colored animals as, to help with thermoregulation, but there's also really light colored animals. So it's kind of a toss up which way it would go. But theoretically, if any kind of coat coloration did confer thermoregulatory advantage in these urban areas, we could see that selected for. But depending on, what that heat difference is and what the general environment is and these kind of other factors that might come into play, I think it would really vary which direction that color selection would go.
Okay, and you mentioned a rule there with which I'm not familiar. Is that Gloger's rule?
I think that's how you pronounce it, at least.
Okay, yeah, I haven't the
but yeah, the trend with that is just that in kind of more humid climates, we tend to have darker, more melanistic animals.
So I think I'd like to talk about deer now, because I was really taken by that, and I've heard of this type of thing before among hunters, where really light colored or piebald deer or leucistic deer are not favored as kind of a hunting quarry for hunters, and in some cases that's even enshrined in law.
Yeah, so there are laws across the United States, depending on which state and which time period you're looking at, but we do have laws that protect white-tailed deer a lot of the time if they are leucistic or piebald, depending on the state, or totally albinistic. So it depends on the state, depends on what time period you're looking at, but there are still these laws in effect today. Some collaborators and I are actually writing a paper on kind of the human perceptions of animals with different colorations, so you can stay tuned for that. But to me, it's really fascinating that, depending on which color the animal is, right, we either provide protections for it, or it could actually incentivize people to hunt those animals as well. So there's a place in Texas that has a high level of melanistic white-tailed deer, and those are preferentially removed from those populations as trophies because they're considered more valuable.
Okay, and is there any actual conservation-driven or ecological reason for these laws, or does it just come down to pure human preference?
If I were to guess, probably not. I think we just think they're cool, and they're novel. There's kind of this whole idea, psychology of like scarcity and rarity that makes us value things that we don't see as often a little bit more. But I'd imagine if it was ecologically valuable for these animals to be, an extreme color, then we'd see it proliferate through the population. We often don't see that especially in non-urban areas. So I'd imagine it doesn't confer a lot of ecological advantage, at least.
Okay, and one of the things you discussed in this article that I've found really interesting is, and something, of course, that you've mentioned already, is the relative paucity of research on these types of topics. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and perhaps why we haven't seen more research in urban environments.
Yeah, I mean, urban ecology as a whole is a relatively nascent field. I think for a really long time, biologists looked at these human-dominated areas and were like, "That's not nature. We don't need to study that." Um, but in my mind, I feel like it's the opposite. Like we are becoming a human-dominated area, right? There's no surface on Earth that's untouched by people. So understanding the way that wildlife and people can coexist and how our impacts impact wildlife on kind of an interaction level, but also on the evolutionary level is really fascinating to me. And I think is really important in moving forward if we want to conserve wildlife and be able to live with them and understand the ways that we're changing wildlife, because inevitably we are. I think like probably the strongest, I don't know what the term I want to use for this is, but kind of evolutionary driver at this point is going to be human mechanisms.
Right. And, I'm wondering, where you would direct that research if you were given, say $10 billion or whatever amount of money. I ask this question on occasion. It's just sort of the research wish list. What sorts of things would you like to see more research on that would kind of illuminate some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question. From a personal standpoint, I feel like I'm really biased here. I think it's all really interesting. Urban ecology is just so cool to me. And I think it's so nascent that there's so much that we don't know. And so if I were going to choose from a personal level, what I want to do for my postdoc at least is look at kind of whole genome sequencing of coyotes as kind of a model species across urban to rural gradients and see what genes might be selected for, what might be accidentally selected for, what kind of genetic drift is happening in different regions. And so I think if I had to say anything, we tend to think of cities as like, okay, you look at one, then you know the trend, and that's not true. So doing these kind of like very large approaches across large scales and many time periods, I think will illuminate the most valuable information.
Great. I think that is an excellent answer to a very unfair question. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.